Hello, my name's Will Wustanoa, and welcome to my podcast reflection for the Communication Skills module. So, searching for topics, I found struggles as I originally wanted to focus the podcast on sports communication, as this links to the career I want to go into. However, when looking and finding connections on LinkedIn, I found that people weren't willing to actually come on and talk in a podcast. So, I realised I had to change the plan. So, I then decided to focus the topic on controlling digital communications within the modern digital world. Now, this decision came from I was currently at the time of completing the podcast. I was partaking in a module of digital communications with Mark Badham, and I was then using this theory that Mark was telling me in the modules within my dissertation. So it really made sense for me to use this module because to use this topic, sorry, because I really enjoyed the module, and I was also applying it in my dissertation, so it would add to that knowledge. Now, once I made this switch, the process became a lot more fluid. I used Mark as my first guest, who was able to get my foot in the door. He then was able to suggest Vilma Valentina, who he co-created the DMA framework with, which is what we talked about on the podcast, and they were my first two guests. And then from that point, I knew I needed to find one more guest, but the search pool was a lot smaller, and I knew the kind of field I wanted to go in. Through LinkedIn, I found Pradeep, who I realised previously studied at Leeds Beckett University. So I used this to draw on connections, invited him to the podcast, and he was more than willing to join, and he was a great third guest. Now, I feel like the podcast had a lot of strengths. As Mark and Vilma are both experts in the field, I feel like this added so much value to the podcast through their expert knowledge. For example, Mark is currently running the module I've previously talked about at Leeds Beckett, whilst Vilma is flying all over the world, Singapore, Paris, Spain, to talk and hold press conferences with CEOs and digital communication practitioners. So having their expert knowledge really added strength to the podcast. Furthermore, the DMA framework discussed within the podcast that them two created is actually the most up-to-date framework within digital communication, and its applicability is also unquestionable, as I'm using it in my dissertation and they have used it in so many pieces of work previously. This was described by Stephen Wannington as the PISO model on steroids, and anyone in public relations know how valuable an insight from Stephen Wannington is. So having such a strong framework and guests to explain it really added to the podcast. I've also said that another strength is having Pradeep, because he was able to show how influencers can still be controlled through digital communications, which from a point of view of people that don't understand digital communication, I feel like that would be a really interesting topic to discuss, because it's almost like the message isn't coming from the organization themselves. How can they still control it? And Pradeep was able to offer that insight. And lastly, the podcast was easy to follow. I planned out a structure, making it easy to listen to, and also Pradeep's answers aligned with what Mark and Vilma were saying in the theory. So it flowed really well, and anyone was able to understand it, whether you have initial knowledge in digital communications or you're listening for the first time. Now, there was also several weaknesses to the podcast. I feel that Mark and Vilma both provided the same view on the same framework. Now, if I could have got guests that had three different views, it would have provided a greater scope for the podcast. Another weakness I've also said is that I often guided the interview to keep it in this structure, and this broke down the natural conversation present within the podcast. And my third weakness is that the amount of guests, having three guests within 15 minutes, I'd say definitely limited the amount they could speak and share their knowledge. So this brings me on to issues and solutions. A main issue was the Wi-Fi connection. Vilma was in a hotel in Singapore, so her connection kept dropping in and out with my connection, and Pradeep was in an office with a lot of background noise. So as a solution, I had to re-record some questions to align with the answers that were most clear, and this was all done within the editing process. Another issue I found was the time limit. Again, having three guests, I had to feel like I had to cut out a lot of key answers. But to do this, I used sound bites and a lot of editing, where I could cut the answers but still allow them to express what they said, but just cut a lot of the talking around the answer. And finally, I've also mentioned that finding the guests was also an issue, but we've already talked about that. Now, what have I learned? I've learned that recording in person will avoid these connection issues, and it also prompts more humanized conversation, which might lead to a better podcast. I've also learned that a longer podcast might be better because it allows the guests to really share their expert knowledge a lot deeper. And I've also learned the importance of editing. Editing and using sound and music is what really captivates the audiences and keeps them engaged throughout the whole podcast. That's all for today. I want to say thank you for listening to The Reflection and thank you for listening to the podcast.